Next question. So I've been in the, I know I don't look it, but I've been in PE for about 30 years now. In fact, our WhatsApp group of people I graduated with were talking about we really should have a 30-year reunion this summer. I don't think it's going to happen, but there you go. That's another conversation. But during that time, we've been having the same conversations. And my ambition, professional ambition, which we're trying to achieve partially, I don't think we're going to completely achieve it, but through the app, through My Move that we're working on at the moment, and will be for the foreseeable future. Because the conversations have been, I don't wish to sound like an old faddy-duddy, but they are very circular. We've been talking for years about, well, what is PE, defining PE, and I was really intrigued that you come out with SPAN, you called it, and breaking down the barriers of sport, PE, physical activity, movement. In my previous job, as you know, I was at Kingston, and we came up with PISA for the same reason, and we used to talk about PISA. And part of it is, as Kathy Armour says, like, who really cares what the difference between PE and sport is, apart from people in PE who talk about it and have been talking about it ad nauseum. But I'll pause there.
Well, only because the place where I disagree with that, who even cares, is where, again, sad of me, but when I was looking at government manifestos, whenever it was, and they were, vying for their place and to get votes, they seem to use the terms PE and sport interchangeably, really? Not recognising that they are discretely different beasts. So it's this perpetual thing, isn't it? Unless we help distinguish and be really clear on what's different, PE will only ever be I call it a basket of sports. It will only ever be this carousel of sports, traditional or not, that you go through. Some you love, others you hate. And I'm like, the Marmite subject like that, that's not really good enough, is it? If we want to turn everyone on to choose to stay active, we got to give a better spread than Marmite.
Well,
so
I think we've got a little bit of daylight here, so let's explore it a little bit further. So this was our thinking, my thinking at Kingston. It was brilliantly articulated by Kathy Armour in the first lockdown podcast that ASIP did on Joe Wicks. And she was saying, I'll quote her or paraphrase her, if a parent walked past a school field or a playground and the children in curriculum time are doing something that's got goals and a ball and they're kicking it, then the parent says, look, they're doing football. Now, the physical educator will say, oh, no, they're doing PE for the purposes of these learning outcomes. And that's distinct from what they're doing in football. But I think so that's why she says, who cares? Because we have to reach out, we have to connect. We can't keep having these conversations that essentially, well, I would put out there, is it just based on academic snobbery that we're defining something differently? It reminds me of lawyers. They make a living out of everyone else's ignorance. So you can't possibly do this because it's far too difficult for you. So therefore, we're going to hide behind Latin terminology and all the rest of it. But here's the thing. I actually think it goes the other way. That sport, and is not the same as youth sport. I'm sure we would agree on that.
Yeah. And
the best youth sport coaches are essentially educators. And indeed, in lots of parts of the world, they have to be. I think Spain, you have to be a teacher to coach under 14 and below football. I might be wrong on that. But and the meeting point for me is, and I guess like you, I've spent probably far too much of my life on touchlines and coaching and all the rest of it. So when I was coaching weekend football and rugby, what was my goal? My goal was to support the kids to be able to flourish through that form of movement, which happened to be football. And I'm successful if they want to sign up for the following year. So to quote Quinishstead, the only sustainable goal of PE is more PE. If they want to do more, then we've won. Which is, again, is why we came up with the app, is the thinking behind the app. How do we know if they want to do more and if they are doing more? So,
and if more of them are doing more, that is the biggest challenge, I think, in schools, is they have a limited workforce.
Yeah.
And because of that, the ones that are most hungry and demanding of their time, and probably the easiest to get success with, are the ones that need the PE teacher the least. I.e., the team of basketballers that I got through to a national final was nothing to do with my coaching time or expertise with them. It was the fact that a flame was ignited. Actually, it was pre-me that the flame was ignited, but they were at my school together in the same year at the same moment. And I think the job of the PE teacher is more to light that flame and to push them out into the community. But so often the PE workforce is spending their hours with the people that need them the least, because they gravitate towards it. Now, that's not to say that we should ignore them, but number of hours put into practices, fixtures, cups, etc., does not mean the same as what you've just described, which is that, well, what proportion of children, or have we got any debutants this week? That's why Parkrun's done so well, is because it looks at celebrating debutants, 5th appearance, 10th appearance, 100th appearance. Exactly. If we want to change habits, we've got to do some, it's like an English teacher going, I'm not going to bother with those kids that can't read. Accelerated reader programs and all the rest of it exist purely because our job is about the rest, not the few that want us.
Well, they're in, the job done. And I had a really difficult conversation with my friend and ex-colleague Alex, who I know you know, and I put to him this question: if a 14-year-old is totally into physical activity, in other words, they identify as part of their identity, is part of their life, for 14-year-olds should they do any curriculum PE? Because the goal has been achieved. The goal is to get kids into activity so that they stay in activity. Now, it was a tongue-in-cheek question, partly because I knew Alex would respond to it and think very deeply and hard about it. But also, bearing in mind that I was one of those people who, coming up to GCSE, sir, can I not do PE because I've got to catch up with my English, and I'm not in a month of Sundays. Are you going to do that? Because you have to do PE. But now I'm a bit older and mellower. If a kid is in, like, why? That is the goal. That's done.
But Greg, that kid that was asking you that question wasn't typically
no, correct. But I'm just reflecting on myself.
But you're dead right. And if we take that to the next level, again, we both operate in the system in England. The only real measurable outcome of PE, I love Mikhail's work as well, but the only one in the national curriculum is swim 25 metres and be water safe. Yeah. So does that mean that we find out what children can swim 25 metres and are water safe, we tick them off and we invest our energies with the rest? Or is there something that we can still give those that can make it to the end of the pool?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in case there are any senior managers who are thinking, just gone straight to their budget spreadsheet to work out how much they can save, I do think it was an awful idea, but I was just putting it out there as a philosophical question for Alex. But I think going back to, is there a difference there? And you mentioned parkrun. I think by that orthodoxy, by the existing orthodoxy, with PE, sport and physical activity being different component parts, if we go to primary schools, and you mentioned that lovely phrase, igniting the flame, if a kid gets really into physical activity through Daily Mile, which, as we're always told, is not PE, it's outside of curriculum time, and that impacts on their life in a way that they then begin to enthuse, they begin to seek out other opportunities, formal or informal, then again, it goes back to that overriding goal of well, essentially of habit formation and habit change, that where physical activity is a normal and natural part of that young person's life. So again, I just wondered, does it really matter what ignites the spark of enthusiasm, as long as we capture it and we've joined up enough to think, well, that's great. And again, another reason why we launched My Move, and one of the things that comes through all the time when we talk to teachers is how surprised they are when they see what young people are doing out of school, and how that shapes what their perception of them. Oh, I never knew you were an Irish dancer or an equestrian, or that you walk the dog every morning with your younger brother. It really changes, because like, we're about, selling quote unquote physical activity and its benefits. And if there's more kids doing it and we know about it, we're sort of seeing them differently. Would you agree with that, Will?
And that's where I guess intelligence is king, and I love the app for that. We always used to do a survey every year asking students a bit about what they did last week to try and capture that, in the moment, because it's a state of movement, isn't it? You can't summarize what you did all of last year.
Yeah.
But it also enabled us to capture, what clubs or things do you do in the PE sport physical activity space, because we want to understand them to celebrate them with you. Yeah. But there is a challenge there in terms of what we were touching on, that idea of, well, if they're in, that's okay.
Yeah.
Well, Tom Daly was in with his diving.
Yeah.
But, and you know what, he's still going with his diving. Great. That alongside his knitting is keeping him happy. And he's been a roller coaster, but he's happier now than he was 4 years ago, 5 years ago. But at some point, diving will stop for him.
Yeah.
And how will he find? And I think this is what I've learned through squash, is the number of people that once their sport stopped, they stop. And again, triathlon is a great, the mammals, there's a great thing there for getting people back involved. I've got a lot of friends that were pretty talented sports people that have turned themselves to some running because their knees, their ankles, their joints can't take the impact of football or rugby or cricket or whatever anymore, or family life has got to, so they found something else. But my fear is always, particularly with swimming, athletics and gymnastics, to really excel in those, you have to do it early.
Yeah.
And those people that dedicate themselves to those, how do we give them the other things to mean that at whatever point, whatever activity is done for you, if I'd have fallen out of love with squash, hopefully what I got from breadth made me find what I loved in squash in something else that was active. And that's my worry, I think, with almost that principle of, and I know it's not what you were suggesting, but that idea of once they're in, our work here is done, whatever their chosen in is.
You throw into the conversation, again, another thing that's been around for a long time, and we grapple with it. I'm not sure we even do grapple with it, actually, because the notion of broad and balanced is absolutely cast in stone, so much to the degree that you hear very few dissenting voices. David Kirk writes brilliantly as in opposition of a mile wide and an inch thick as a strategy, as a curriculum base to get kids into physical activity, because you lack the authenticity, you lack the real, I guess you don't have the chance to educate affectively, emotionally, to get that connection with an activity when you're doing 6 weeks and 2 weeks are rained off and the hall's not available for the third week. So effectively you've done 2 weeks of badminton, which of course isn't really badminton, is, I don't know, pitter-patter or whatever it is. And it goes, what you're saying around, educating for long-term activity. And I think it was Justin O'Connor who recently published a paper on how do we educate for informal participation. But I've probably spent like far too long for my own well-being thinking about this, actually. And there's a Alex introduced me to a sociologist called Jay Coakley, who's regarded as like the godfather of sports sociology. And in a brilliant podcast, I think it was called Something Champions, he says if we want to know how to create support, help young people be active, we need to look at people in their 40s, 50s and 60s who are active and work back to figure out why they're still active. And when I tried to do that, and you mentioned about people going from, I don't know, from the rugby field to cycling, well, I think one of the things that they get is that deep connection with their physical self and with movement. That becomes really an essential part of who they are, right?
And the social thing that comes from it. It comes to, some of the great work, Tim Fletcher, etc., are doing around meaningful PE. Yeah. It's, well, what are those things that make it meaningful?
Yeah.
On your broad and balanced point, I couldn't agree more. Like I'm in the middle of a PE curriculum design course with 100 subject leaders at the moment. And when I talk about breadth and balance, I talk about the 3 A's of breadth and balance. One of those is the activity. The other is the approach that you use, the models-based practice, whatever terminology you want to use. And the other is the assessment that you choose, the success criteria that you lay on top of that. And broad and balanced, if you're not considering all 3 of those A's, if you're just doing more and more different activities, you're not broad and balanced at all. You are just, particularly if it's just another invasion game being added to the list.
Yeah.
That's the furthest thing from broad and balanced.
But Will, you could take that to the nth degree. So if you had a kid who's really enthused, really passionate about a single activity, like skateboarding or surfing or squash, right? Does it matter? And again, I'm just putting it out there, be challenging, facetious. Does it matter if they don't do anything else? Because are we really saying, and I think this is like, let's take a reality check and a truth check. Are we really saying that year 8 gymnastics, those 6 lessons, will be drawn upon when that young person is in their 30s and they're not able to skateboard anymore? Is it because they did gymnastics when they were 12 that they can then diversify? Or is it because they've got such a deep emotional attachment with that particular activity that when that goes, they need to find activity being in their life? They need to find another playground. They need to find that joy elsewhere.
So I guess we've just been through a real life trial of this, haven't we? COVID-19 took squash away from me because that sweaty box was considered a very unsafe place to be. And I guess what I did at that moment was, and it maybe wasn't that conscious, but I thought about what I was losing from my life with squash not in it. And I found different ways to fill that jar back up. And I guess the point you're getting at is if they can make that strong emotional connection to something, and then the skills that they develop in that. So in fact, it's probably the skills I developed in squash and rugby outside of school that eventually I got the confidence. I went to a school, a state school that seemed to value football and cricket. I didn't really play much of either of those sports. So for a long time, I wasn't very good in PE. In fact, I wasn't very good in school sport. But eventually, I got enough confidence, but also those skills were honed enough in those other activities that I could transfer across. But that was quite late for me, the moment at which that happened. And then that triggered a spark in basketball, for example, and then I really pushed that. So I do think we have a duty to expose to more than just, once you've found the flavor of ice cream that you like, you don't stop having different ice creams just to see if there's another one that's good too, do you?
No, you don't. But you develop a love of ice cream. And if you have that first ice cream and you think, I can't bear that, it puts you off all ice cream.
skiing is a great example of that. I've got friends that went on their first ski trip and it was icy and rubbish, and the beer was too expensive. Consequently, they haven't been skiing again. But if you can get a lucky first trip with some good snow and some cheap beer, you'll forget the rubbish ski trips because they fall in amongst, you'll find, I surf. When there's no waves, it's okay, because a part of me going surfing is the people I go with that I capture around the experience.
But there's also the breadth within the skiing about the things that you can connect to. So if you have that poor conditions, but you can connect to the environment, the ecology, the quiet, the peace of the ski lift, the challenge of having to navigate, and you've got the wherewithal to navigate different
coping with the ice.
Yeah, you've got that literacy. You can only get through authenticity.